one of the most prolific digital health and life science experts, to the Digital Health Summit stage to deliver our closing keynote. Sorry, tongue-tied today. Wainwright Fishburne Jr., the global head of the digital health practice at Cooley, and is recognized as a life science and digital health thought leader. Let's welcome him with a warm round of applause for this.
Thank you very much, Jill. Thank you. Okay, cocktail to relax, virtual reality to relax. What do you think? Okay, pivots, hockey sticks, and unicorns, oh my. Being the last person between you and cocktails, not easy, but I'm going to try and do just a very quick overview of what 2017 was all about in the venture world, and then move from there to a few predictions. So I come to this conversation dominantly as a venture capital lawyer. Cooley is a firm that started in Silicon Valley and has extended beyond that, now across every really technology center in the US and the UK and China as well. I also am the chair, as Jill said, of the Digital Health Group, and in that role have watched this ecosystem really since the very beginning. So let's do one thing real quick. Everyone stand up and just take a deep breath as we're getting ready for cocktails. How many people have been here since the very beginning? All right, that's great. So the way I come to this conversation is dominantly through the role as a partner at Cooley, but I've spent a lot of other time in my philanthropic time working in medical research, both from the clinical and the basic research perspective. And I'm also the vice chair of an organization called the Critical Path Institute, which is a public-private partnership spawned by the FDA and is focusing on any number of ways to make the drug development and product development process more efficient through the regulatory path. And just as an example, one of the things they've done is they've gotten a lot of companies together from all the major pharmaceutical players and said, let's share pre-competitive data. So all of the work and all of your learnings in clinical trials that is before you get to the more advanced trials, let's get together and share that so that we can make that process more efficient. A lot about patient-reported outcomes, and as I'll talk a little bit later today, a lot of conversation around what's happening in digital health and how the FDA can enable that. So Cooley's leadership in digital health did not come about by accident, so let me just say a word or two about the firm. For the last 5 years, we have been the #1 firm in the country representing life science and technology companies that go public, either on the company side or the underwriter side. So what that really means is it means that we have, for the most part, gotten involved when it was 2 engineers and a dog, or maybe a doctor and your brother-in-law starting the company, and then we've watched the path that they all take through the various stages of expansion. We currently represent about half the companies on the NASDAQ Biotech Index, and what I like to say that defines my life is we never know what we're likely to be doing 3 years from now, because chances are it has not yet happened in the same way that a lot of the things that we've been witnessing over this last few days were not on anyone's mind even a small number of years ago. So let's talk a little bit about some of the basic data, and I think you probably have seen this or data like this many times, but this is essentially the very, very real hockey stick of what's been happening in the finance world in digital health. So back in early 2010, even I'd probably been involved in the ecosystem for 3 or 4 years prior to that, just barely over $1 billion went in, all the way up to north of 11 billion this year. And if you can imagine roughly 35 billion at the lower end of the scale over this period, you need, from a venture capitalist perspective, at a minimum, to be able to double that in value. But to get the kind of breakthrough reality opportunities that these groups look for, you need to build much more. So we'll talk a little bit about what's been happening in that value creation. So I've tried to broadly say, what are the digital health sectors? I think Jill has done a fabulous job over this last couple of days of curating tastes in each of the various areas. But at the top, I said, what are some of the companies and some of the concepts that touch all of the areas of actual healthcare as it goes from healthcare provider to the customer, to the consumer. And so you'll see a lot of companies that have unfolded around consumer health information, a lot around consumer engagement. Take the demonstration that we just had. Telemedicine, there's some estimates that by 2020, half your visits, half the medical visits in this country will be via some form of video chat, or maybe it's even virtual reality. And then the more challenging, but really some of the companies that are going to move the needle around some of our biggest problems around cost are companies that have looked for platform-wide solutions across the whole healthcare system. Another line of topics that you see investment falling into is the whole area of population health, and it touches enterprise wellness and some of the things that Adam was talking about that Canary is trying to work on, and prediabetes. A lot of these sensors and platforms are now creating opportunities for expanded use of analytics and big data. I'll talk a little bit about what's happening in genomics, because that is really one of the areas that we've gotten just a tremendous amount of focus and attention. And we're getting it dominantly because the tools of genomics are advancing at rates that we probably never thought possible, Moore's Law type movement. But more importantly, once the tools are available, the elements to better understand the application or the opportunity that is buried in that genomic data is where a lot of the focus is. And these are all problems that we could not have even considered to conquer even as few as 5 years ago. And then just looking at the last areas, the whole arena of sensors, biosensors. I love to talk about the Fitbits of the world, because I think it was a great example of an area that the classic venture capital firms would really not have touched a couple decades ago or a decade ago, because any kind of a consumer product, a consumer electronics product, was just extraordinarily difficult to get the kinds of returns that you necessarily are looking for, because the expense of attracting a broad consumer base was almost unthinkable given the scale of dollars that were often being invested. That has changed completely, but I think more importantly, Fitbit has given you an opportunity to begin to have, at the simplest level, a relationship with your body. And if anyone has wandered through the hall, you just see example after example after example of the various applications now of some of this sensor technology. At the simplest, let's take the Fitbit as the example, and then we'll talk a little bit about the much more complex, which are the kinds of technologies that end up requiring FDA and regulatory approval. And then, of course, all of these solutions are focused on the most singular important topic around our whole country and our whole world today, and that is making healthcare accessible, maintaining the quality, but slaying the cost dragon. And so many of these solutions are focused in that area. So I thought I'd just give you a quick snapshot. These are the most active venture capital investors in the digital health arena. There's a much larger list, as you can imagine, but when we sort through all the data, these are the groups that have put the most to work via dollars. And what you see is a very unique group of venture investors, and those are typically the investors that have, over the last 10 to 20 years, developed a core expertise not only in the life science arena, but also in the digital or the media or cellular technology arenas. And so they end up not being afraid of the complex big data algorithms when it's applied to regulatory science and cancer algorithms for development of an immunotherapy, as an example. So moving forward, let's do that by looking back. So when I first gave this talk in 2012, we did a quick landscape view of companies that had raised 50 to 100 million, 100 to 150 million, and more than 150 million. So if you look at this list of companies, I'm about to show you another slide of what it looks like today, but it also underscores that each and every one of these companies has a story. And maybe the most fun to use as a reference point is 23andMe, because if there's a company that has been perseverant, that has pivoted, and I think we're really coming into 2018 to see the best of opportunities for the things that have been represented by the 23andMe path. We'll have some fun talking about that either in this session or we have a chance to be together in some other setting. So let me go back for just a minute. I was going to use, as an example, Airstrip. So one of my notions as you look at this field is 5 years ago when we were just getting started, we were saying to ourselves, this is going to be revolutionary, it's going to be disruptive, everything's going to change. And I think if there's anything we've learned is this is an evolutionary business rather than a revolutionary business. So you're not going to see the kind of disruption that Uber or social media, Facebook and others brought to our culture, because the healthcare problem is just too embedded and the traditions of medical care are too historic and well validated with evidence that you're not just going to change your modalities. So I use that as a backdrop to talk about Airstrip. So this is 2 years after Airstrip was in business. They talked about putting on a single sheet of glass, your iPad, all of the information that a practitioner would need was one of their use cases. And they did a very effective job of getting into the electronic medical record systems. They were one of the first groups to break the code to put live waveforms, so EKG and other monitors, and so constant monitoring of the patient, plus all of the historic data about who the caregivers were, what the drug-drug interactions were, so on and so forth. But in order to do that, it was an immense effort to become accepted in the ecosystem. And so they talked about the people that they first went in front of, which were the innovators, then the early adopters, then the early majority, and then the late majority. And I can tell you the Airstrip is still making progress on that path today, but this gives you some notion of the pipes, if you will, that were needed to be built. This is another slide that they showed back in that era. And at that point, they had 300 live hospitals, something like 30,000 practitioners using Airstrip. On the left-hand side of the slide, you see the quality of capital that came in, not only from the venture capital industry, but also from strategics such as Qualcomm Life. And then on the right-hand side, Dignity Health, among others. So a very comprehensive way of approaching what I'll call not a point solution, but an enterprise solution in digital health. And from the venture capital perspective, when you look at decisions, you either are going to choose something that is going to be a point solution, and it's going to be a very, very effective point solution, and probably will be a good return, but probably is not going to be a billions and billions of dollars of value built. Or you can look at something that really is going to change the world, and that's what a lot of these companies are focused on. So this is our map from last year. You can take a look at the change. The number of companies that have raised 50 or more, and this is a cumulative slide, 100 million or more. But what's on this slide that was not on the earlier slide is the number that were acquired and the number that went public. Interestingly, 2017 was a little slower year for both M&A, and there were no public offerings out of our sector. So that led to in that $11 billion that went in, a lot of later round financings, and it's hard to tell for sure whether those were keeping the companies going or it was really for accelerated growth. So I'm going to just take a very quick roll through a couple of the fields that we talked about in the beginning, just to give you a landscape view of the world. So the first is regulated devices. At the outset, you're looking at a question when you become an investor. Are you going to bear the burden of taking your product, your process, whatever it might be, through the FDA regulated world? And so this gives you the number of companies that actually have gone through that process. Two that I'll highlight as both AliveCor and iRhythm, that are companies that started very early on, and each of them in their own way are getting tremendous traction today, but they were very perseverant both in the FDA regulatory process, but also in developing the use case for their particular products as we move forward. From the regulatory perspective, 51 connected health products were approved by the FDA in 2017. So that's a really stunning number, and much larger than any of the the numbers in years earlier. So what it really tells you is that this is a group of companies that are slowly marching along. You may not get a lot of fanfare, you may not see a lot of what's going on, and these regulatory products have touched everything from diabetes management to chronic pain to cardiac monitoring, and then 23andMe was another example where they got a little bit more permissiveness from the FDA in allowing the use of I'm going to talk briefly about Otsuka and Proteus. This is something that we would not have thought about 5 years ago, but it's basically a chip on a pill, and it has gotten FDA approval, but it also is approved to go on a schizophrenic drug, Abilify from Otsuka. And if you can imagine something like schizophrenia, there's nothing more important than knowing whether your patient has been compliant. So this was just a very recent example of an entirely new category and a fabulous use case. So stay tuned on that one. So here's the next broad sector, same group of companies, but genomics, analytics, and big data. You see a very different group of companies that are covered here, and I'm going to just keep moving through this. Genomics, as I alluded to at the very beginning, is one of the areas that has become increasingly ripe for both investment and opportunity, and this chart shows you the investment that has gone into the genomics area. 23andMe, Helix, Grail, Guardant are several good examples. Helix and Grail were both spawned by Illumina, one of the leaders in developing the sequence capability, and has been driving the cost of sequencing down. Helix is a direct-to-consumer. You get sequenced once, and then you can always go back and revisit your sequence and have a whole myriad of products that are available to you, everything from as simple as Ancestry to more sophisticated things, having to do with diet, exercise, and some along the therapeutic scale as well, but all non-regulated. And they just went through their first Christmas season, so it'll be interesting to see how they progress. The last is consumer-facing. Let me just close on this. You can see the number of companies that in one way or another are going directly into the consumer space. We have had a really nice group of companies that have exited in that arena as well. Empowered consumers will no question be a big part of the story going forward. We've talked a lot about, over the last couple of days, the empowered healthcare consumer. There was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal this morning about a group of patients that are basically bringing an action against their Obamacare health plan because they're feeling that the quality of care that they're getting through this plan is not as advertised. So that's one example of the consumer voice coming forward into the story, and then all of the consumer-facing products and simple things, the way we go to visit our practitioners, and they're very interested in what our experience was, all underscores the power of the consumer. And finally, a big picture piece that's happening that I think is going to be one of the opportunities to really drive some of the very impactful changes that are coming from our digital health environment is what's happening in the payer landscape. So the consolidation, and then examples of Aetna and CVS pulling together, other examples where you've got Kaiser, Geisinger, where much more fully integrated groups that are thinking about risk management and population health in ways that we've never thought about those questions before. Or I won't say we've never thought about them. We've thought about them a lot, but we've never been able to implement integrated solutions. And so the example of when you've got 70 million lives or you've got 50 million lives, you really have an opportunity to make an impact for this platform-wide changes. So in bringing it to a close, what are my crystal balls? I think the regulatory guidelines are further validations of our ecosystem. I think the next stop is going to be additional adoption of these digital therapies, and I like the comment that was made by our last group about the future of fully integrated. I do think that global genomics will drive change. Let me give just one small example of that. So India has 1.3, 1.5 billion people on the subcontinent, and as we sit today, 0.2% of all of the genomes in our genome databases of all genomes that have been sequenced to date come from that subcontinent or people of that ethnicity. And so it just shows that it's dominantly sort of Caucasian, Europeans are the first groups, the first wave, if you will. And so there's a great move to getting much more diverse databases pulled together. And so I think the whole globalization of genomics is something that'll be on the horizon. And then without question, the winners are going to be the ones that generate the cost savings, but at the same time celebrate the care. So with that, I think it's time for no cocktails. We're all going to just go in the back and hum. But Jill, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wayne. Was I right? That was like, talk about 15 minutes of like power pack. So